Welcome to session 256 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 13th of September. Today we'll be looking at John's 1 to 2 and Psalm 101. But first of all, let's get an overview of John. Today we start John's Gospel. And John's Gospel is likely the last Gospel written, dated around 90 to 110 CE. The author only identifies himself at the end of the Gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's John 21 verses 20 to 22. There are a few Johns that could fit this description, but tradition suggests that this is John, the brother of James, part of Jesus' 12 closest disciples. Out of the four, John's Gospel is fairly unique. Both Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as their basis and then add their own spin on it. This means that these three Gospels often feel very similar, sometimes sharing whole paragraphs that are exactly the same. This isn't the case with John, and so his perspective is completely unique. While the other Gospels often focus on Jesus' humanity, John chooses to focus on his divinity. Because of this, many of the stories of Jesus struggling or suffering are left out, such as Jesus' prayer to God at Gethsemane. This isn't because John doesn't think they happened, but for him they distract from the focus, which is the story of Jesus, God in human form. Let's be clear, John isn't talking about a different Jesus. He's not saying the other gospel authors got it wrong. He just wants to emphasize something that he thinks the other gospel writers missed. Here is a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. But we start with John 1, the prologue. Then we have John 2 to 10, Jesus' public ministry. And this can be split into two parts. We have John 2 to 4, which is Jesus interacting with 4 Jewish institutions. And then we have John 5 to 10, Jesus interacting with 4 Jewish festivals. This then leads on to John 11 to 12, which is the raising of Lazarus and the journey to Jerusalem. Then in Jerusalem, we have John 13 to 17, Jesus' private ministry. And this can be split up into John 13, with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, and then John 14 to 17, Jesus' private discourse and his prayer for the disciples. Moving on, we have John 18 to 20, the crucifixion and resurrection, and then finally John 21, the epilogue. In his pursuit of this emphasizing the divinity of Jesus, John uses two groups of 7 I am statements and 7 signs. In Matthew 14, 22 to 33, we looked at how Jesus saying, "It is I," was a reference to God's name back in Exodus 3:14. Here in John, Jesus is going to make 7 I am statements, ego eimi in the Greek, that reflect a different aspect of Jesus' divine nature. This is going to culminate in an 8th ego eimi I am statement near the end of the book, which really demonstrates Jesus' divinity. In the same way, we also get 7 signs that demonstrate Jesus' authority as the Son of God. These then culminate in the 8th greatest sign, which is Jesus' resurrection from the dead. John is demonstrating the divine power and authority of Jesus. The last thing to note is John's use of the Jews. Multiple times in John's Gospel, we see people in opposition to Jesus, and they are often referred to as the Jews. It is likely that the Jews refer specifically to religious leaders, and that is often how I'm going to refer to them throughout this book. We have religious leaders such as the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and members of the Sanhedrin. But it's also possible that by the time John's Gospel is being written, Christianity is further separating itself from the Jewish tradition, and this phrase is a marker of that. But for now, let's jump in with today's reading, John 1 to 2. John begins his Gospel with the line, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John 1 verse 1. We will soon see that this word is Jesus. And so John is telling his readers that this man called Jesus is not just a man. He has been around since the beginning, both with God and equal to him. It has been intentionally written to sound similar to Genesis 1 verse 1, because John is retelling that story with a new lens. When God spoke the earth into being, Jesus was there, active in making it happen. This word is life and it is light. And this word became flesh and blood and dwelt among us. That's John 1 verse 14. The Greek word for dwelt here is the same root word used for the tabernacle back in Exodus. Just like the tabernacle was the physical place where God's presence and earth met, now that place is in this physical body of the God-man, Jesus. And just as Moses brought the law, Jesus is a new Moses bringing grace and truth. John wants to make it clear that Jesus' ministry is not separate from the works of Moses. Jesus is the fulfillment of what Moses brought. His role, to make God known. And so we focus on a man named John. We know him as John the Baptist from other Gospels. This John has been baptizing people in water. And when the religious leaders ask him who he is, he replies, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord," as the prophet Isaiah said. That's John 1 verse 23. John the Baptist is preparing the way of the Lord, and the one he is preparing for is Jesus. Jesus is the Lord. The very next day, John sees Jesus and gives him another title and purpose, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's John 1 verse 29. So far, Jesus is the Word, the life, and the light, all found in Genesis 1. And he is both the tabernacle and the Passover lamb found in Exodus. John declares that just as he has been baptizing in water, Jesus will baptize in the Holy Spirit. But note what story is missing here. There's no explicit mention of Jesus' baptism. For John, Jesus is God in the flesh. He is the one who baptizes others. There's also no mention of Jesus going into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. For John, Jesus is so far above Satan that any temptation is far too insignificant to mention. Then Jesus calls his first disciples, each of whom immediately recognize who he is. Andrew tells his brothers that they have found the Messiah, the Christ, the King that they have been waiting for. Nathanael realizes that Jesus is the Son of God. With this introduction to John's Gospel finished, John now launches straight into Jesus' ministry, focusing first on his public ministry. In the first half of Jesus' public ministry, we focus on Jesus' interactions with 4 Jewish institutions. The first is a wedding in Cana. While at a wedding, the hosts run out of wine. Jesus' mother encourages him to do something, and at first Jesus resists. But his mother insists, and so he tells the servants to gather 6 large jugs of water. Altogether, this would have been over 100 litres. Jesus miraculously turns the water into wine and sends it out. The master of the feast tastes the wine and is impressed with the quality. John describes this as Jesus' first sign. Just as a wedding is a covenant between a husband and a wife, Jesus is bringing in a new covenant, a new kingdom that is generous in both quantity and quality. The next institution is the temple, God's presence on earth where he meets his people. Jesus goes to the temple and sees it filled not with worship, but with corrupt traders. Immediately he begins to chase them out. In this, we see Jesus' role to redeem. He has come to take places that have been desecrated and restore them to be places of God's presence. The religious leaders demand some kind of sign to show how he has the authority to cast out the traders like this. Jesus points them to a sign that would come later. Destroy the temple and he will rebuild it in 3 days. They assume he's talking about the literal temple and refuse to believe that he can rebuild in 3 days what took 46 years to build. But Jesus was talking about his own body. This sets up a repeated theme in John, with the religious leaders and others misunderstanding Jesus, often known as the misunderstanding motif. Like other Gospels, these misunderstandings are highlighted to cause the reader to reflect on them and decide what is really happening. Just like Jesus is the new tabernacle, he's also the new temple. Both the places represented where God's presence and earth met. But now, this is happening in Jesus' body. If someone wants to meet with God, then they can come to Jesus. Note how both Matthew and Mark have this story near the end of their Gospels. Both use this story as the culmination of Jesus' ministry. The king has entered his city and has cleared out the temple with his authority. John places the story at the beginning of his gospel. He wants you to see from the beginning of Jesus' ministry that it is one of opposition. Then comes a short passage that Jesus didn't want to entrust himself to anyone because he knew all people and knew what was in everyone. That's John 2 verses 24 to 25. Jesus can see the hearts of people and know what they are thinking, just as God can. Have a look at 1 Kings 8 verse 39 and Psalm 139 verse 2. But that is John 1 to 2. Now let's look at Psalm 101. This psalm is attributed to King David and is believed to fall into the category of royal psalm. This isn't because of its content, but because of its context. It's believed that this psalm was said by a king, perhaps at their coronation, as a vow for how they would lead. Here is a summary of the structure. We have verses 1 to 2, commitment to justice and integrity. Verses 3 to 5, avoid the wicked. And then verses 6 to 8, I will stand by the faithful and destroy the wicked. The psalmist, a king, starts with their commitment to love and justice. They will think upon how to live a blameless life and how to walk with integrity. In contrast, they won't even look at anything wrong. If others do wrong, the psalmist will make sure it doesn't affect or contaminate them. They will keep those who are wicked away from them so they have no opportunity to engage with evil. As part of their justice, the psalmist will destroy the wicked who slanders innocent people in their arrogance. The psalmist then reiterates their stance. Those who are faithful and good, the psalmist will support. They will allow those who live rightly to come close to them, but those who are wicked will not come close to them. Instead, the psalmist will destroy them, removing them from the land and from access to God's presence. This psalm reaffirms the role of Israel's human kings to pursue righteousness and justice and to remove wickedness from their lands. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.